As Corla, in the days leading up to the budget, we were told to expect a family-friendly budget, one that would help hard-pressed families. What we've got today instead has been a litany of cuts and tax increases, which taken together with the last two budgets show a government which is both lacking in imagination and a basic commitment to fairness. The last two budgets hit hardest at those relying on public services. It has been our view all along that the split of taxes and expenditure adjustment in this budget should have been in the order of 50-50, but you have chosen not to do that. You have chosen to put the brunt on the expenditure reductions and let those people who rely on state services, the Department of Health, the Department of Social Protection and Education, bear the brunt of those costs. It is what we call a regressive budget. Today again we see the government is making the burden of the adjustment fall disproportionately on those people who can least afford it. But we do know we do not get the full story here this afternoon. Last year, and I expect the same will happen tonight and tomorrow, a series of press releases will come from various departments highlighting the specific measures and cuts that are not being highlighted here this afternoon. They will be even more painful than what we have heard here in the last hour or two. There is no doubt that there is one common thread in this budget. It hits the elderly generation extremely hard, with young out-of-work people also in the Minister's sights. The government have called for intergenerational solidarity in the past, but what they have announced today will ensure that that cannot happen. I in particular move on to the issue of medical card eligibility. For the second year running, the government has shamefully cut the eligibility criteria for medical cards for our elderly people. You are attacking our parents and our grandparents, the people over 70 years of age. We all know from research carried out by the ESRI that medical cards are a progressive anti-poverty measure. They provide an essentially safety net of access to GP care, medicines and hospital treatment for low-income families and older people who are most likely to have greater health care needs. For a government that talks about creating a universal accessible health system, it is actually intent on undermining and eroding access to the health care, as evidenced by these cuts. There has been a reduction in the discretionary medical cards and a fall in the numbers of families with GP visit cards. We are seeing a blatant healthcare rationing on economic grounds. Clinical and health needs are being ignored. The number of discretionary cards has been specifically targeted by this government. The ministers say there is no policy change, but the practice being implemented on a daily basis by the HSE is some way different. People throughout the country have been receiving letters from the HSE advising them a review of their medical card. Many people have had their cards withdrawn recently, and this will intensify as the changes announced in today's budget. Last year, you reduced the medical card weekly income limit for people over 70 years of age by €100 a week for a single person and €200 for a couple. Today, you're reducing it by another €100 per person, but €300 per couple. What have you against elderly married people that there's a more than double the cut where there's a couple in a house as opposed to a single person? You're bringing the figure down now to €900, which was only €1,400 just two budgets ago. At least 35,000 elderly people will lose their medical card because of that decision alone. 35,000 elderly people are watching here today who are going to lose their medical card as a result of that. And in fact, that was based on you making a reduction of 200, but in fact the figure is probably higher now, it's 300 per couple. The medical card is highly valued by older people and low-income people throughout the country. It provides them with reassurance and a right of access to health care, which people in their 70s are at a specific time in their life that they have greater and more significant health care needs. Many of the services needed by these elderly people are not easily assessed through private health care. And you have come along today again to cut the tax relief on private health care insurance for many of the elderly people who need very good quality health care packages because they can't rely on the health care system, especially now that you're reducing the medical card. So some of the elderly people are going to be hit on the income tax relief for the VHI or other private health insurance, and you're also hitting them by removing the medical card. There's a very good reason to provide for older people with free health care services, because we all know their physical health deteriorates as they get older. However, one by one, the commitments made in the programme for government is being abandoned in this regard. Universal health insurance will never see the light of day, and the white paper we were promised is just in the Minister's imagination. We were told there would be funding to provide more residential places, more home care packages, and the delivery of more home health and other professional community services. The opposite is the reality. The Fair Deal scheme has a waiting list of 1,500 people and is on the brink of collapse. Last week in the Dáil debate, a Fianna Fáil private member's motion dealt specifically with discretionary medical cards. When you came to government, 80,000 people in Ireland had a discretionary medical card on medical grounds. The figure as we speak today is 53,000. And of course you'll say there's no policy to reduce the number of discretionary medical cards, but the facts show otherwise. However, when you look past the headline figure, the situation is even worse. We have heard of cases where applications are not granted in the case of young children with multiple complex conditions and adults with severe illnesses such as cancer and motor neuron disease, and many of our incapacitated senior citizens are being denied their medical card under this practice being operated by the HSE. There is a clear intent to reduce the number of people who have a medical card, and this is regardless of their health care needs. Today's budget changes are a further step in the process of the practice that you have underway. There is one positive development in relation to medical cards, and I do have to say the extension of the free GP card to under 5 is welcome in itself, and I think everybody will join that. However, that will do nothing to the many families with young children over 5 years of age suffering from serious medical conditions who are actually currently denied medical card. It is shameful that the expansion of categories of patients covered by the medical card scheme is coming at the cost of reduced cover for other core low-income groups. There are people who have been refused discretionary medical cards even though they have been diagnosed with the debilitating clinical condition. This is simply not fair. It is worth recalling that it was only in August of this year that the Minister of State in the Department of Health wrote to parents in Galway to say that the Department was unable to state when children with intellectual disabilities who are leaving school this year will be offered appropriate services due to the current funding situation. Parents were told that some places will be offered which will not fully address these individual requirements. The government's original long-term plan to bring the so-called free long-term illness patients scheme has fully floundered over the last year or so, and the same might happen with medical card scheme for the under 25. I want to join with one measure that I know the Minister, who is now leaving, and I know he probably has a media appointment to go to, and it's an example of the commitment from the government side in relation to Dáil reform. After the Senate vote last week, they spoke about Dáil reform. We're here in a situation that most of the opposition people have still to speak. The Minister of Finance and the Minister of Public Expenditure have left the building.
Media is more important.
The media is more important rather than the National Parliament. That's the commitment to political reform and in this chamber. I will say, in relation to the cost of medical drugs and other prescribed items, last year's announcement by the Minister that his measures would reduce the cost of drugs and prescribed items would save 160 million in 2013 and 330 million in 2014 and subsequent years. We all know that these figures are a figment of the Minister's imagination and never ever happened, and they never will. The Department of Health has been promising for the last 2 years to make substantial savings in this area, and they've clearly failed to achieve their targets. It recently emerged at the Public Accounts Committee that the senior officials, and Taoiseach, I'd like you to listen to this just for a moment, that the senior officials in the Department of Health and the HSE who are responsible for purchasing these drugs and prescribed items have never met the suppliers of these products face to face. This is a shocking situation, and it does explain why they are not getting the best price. I recently asked the Chief Executive of the IDA could he help the Irish taxpayer in getting a better price for products in relation to IDA client companies here in Ireland. The Chief Executive of the IDA refused point blank to do so. The IDA have refused to engage even with the Department of Health and the HSE on this matter. This behaviour is not acceptable. I actually believe that all government employees must work together for the good of the Irish taxpayer. Finally, on this particular topic, I believe the Department of Health and the HSE has failed, and they do not have the ability to achieve these savings. And the task of procuring drugs and other prescribed items should be taken from the Department and the HSE and handed over to the Government Procurement Office in Minister Howland's own department. In relation to the health figures here mentioned today, I do have to highlight some of the items in the Minister's book that has been circulated. And we talk about medical cards. I want to put on the record the cuts to medical cards that's happening here in Ireland, and it's in your booklet as circulated. The first item I want to say is you're saying you're reducing the income threshold for the over 70s to €900 per week income level for a couple and 500 for a single person. That will save 25 million, according to the Minister's figures. He goes on to say that the medical card probity examination will save 113 million. So effectively, everybody with a medical card better be aware that from tonight on, the Minister is out to hunt them down and cancel as many of those as possible. It's the single biggest saving in the Department of Health to cancel existing medical cards that people have out there. He's identified a saving of 113 million in relation to current live medical cards to ensure they're cancelled in 2014.
Only mean one thing.
And he also goes on to say, and this is another mean one, and we're talking about getting people back to work. Listen to this. Instead of the retention of the full medical card where a person returns to work, they will now only be given a GP card, and that's going to save the Department of Health and the HSE 11 million. Those three savings between the over 70s, cutting the medical card from people who should be incentivised to go back to work. This is counterproductive and runs directly in the opposite direction of what the Minister of Finance is saying about encouraging people back to work. One of the reasons are people don't want to lose the value of a medical card, and now we're here today saying if you do go back to work, yes, you will lose your medical card. We'll give you a GP card, but we won't be long about taking that from you as well. So you're actually counterproductive. All those savings in the medical card budget this year in 2014 will amount to 149 million. So people with medical cards better be aware that this government is after you. Also, in relation to the prescription charges, there has been a 500% increase in prescription charges since you came to government. It started off at 50 cent an item, and now it has gone to €2.50 starting next year. That is a major and substantial increase. And of course, you did promise, Mr. Kenny, in your budget campaign in 2011 to abolish that prescription charge. Not only was it 50 cents when you came to government, you increased it to $1.50 last year, and now you're increasing it to $2.50. And again, we know who is going to pay for that. That's a figure that's going to affect many, many people, and it will cost about €20 per week for many people who are relying on that. In relation to the Department of Health, there's a figure of savings here of 666 million to be achieved as a result of the budget announced today. Last year's budget announced here said the savings in the Department of Health announcement from last year were to achieve a further 400 million carry forward in 2014. And when that's added to the 666 million announced today, there'll be a cut in the HSE budget in the coming year of over 1 billion. No wonder you're attacking the medical cards, and I'm sure the core budget in the Department of Health does not stand up. It is flawed, it is not accurate, is going to collapse, and the core centre of that budget will not hold, and we will be back here talking about supplementary estimates as time goes on. I also now want to move on to the Department of Social Protection, and I know the Labour leader, Mr Gilmore, is here today, and he will pay particular interest in these areas because his own deputy leader is in that department. And again, I am surprised here today that when I recall this time last year, one of your colleagues sitting beside you said here in the chamber last year, I think we need to realise that one group of people in this country have come through the crash and still have their income intact, and they are the pensioners. Well, it doesn't hold water here today, Minister, 12 months on. There has been a raft of cuts and charges over the last 2 years, which commenced with a reduction in the fuel allowance from 32 to 26 weeks. You also increased the tax on solid fuel. You increased tax in their dirt savings, and you've done it again here today. People will be afraid to put money in the bank when you're going to take 41% of it off them by way of deposit interest retention tax. You'll be putting it into their homes and holding it at home, and that's not safe. You have slashed the home help hours for the elderly people, and the rising cost of medical insurance has gone up enormously due to government policy. And again, you've removed the tax relief on some of that here today as well. I've also already mentioned the increase in the prescription charges, which will cost €20 a month to many people. You've changed the income threshold for medical cards for the older people. You've cut the respite grant for older people in the last 12 months, and elderly people will have to pay a full year's property tax in the coming year. But they're all what you have been doing. But the abolition of the telephone allowance is the third round of measures which are hitting the living standards of elderly people. This allowance enables older people to keep in touch by phone with their families and neighbours. It gives them the comfort of keeping in touch without it being too expensive. It makes them feel safe and secure in their homes. It is a miserable cut on the older generation who already feel isolated. Has the Minister considered the case of vulnerable elderly people living on their own, using the pendant around their neck as the alarm to alert the family member in case of emergency? Those pendants of the older people that they have around their neck in their houses, we see them in our elderly relations, is linked to the landline in the house. And you are cutting that allowance. So cutting this payment for this vital support to this level is an example of where this government has descended. You're cutting the emergency lifeline whereby elderly people can contact a member of their family in case of an emergency, and you're abolishing the allowance for their telephone. I think if you'd actually thought it through, I'm actually genuinely asking you to reverse this. The government, in the process of gutting the household benefits package, which I've just been mentioning, the telephone, are failing to recognise the social and economic value of this particular benefit. And who are we talking about here? We're talking about every pensioner in the country over 70 years relies on the free telephone allowance. And we're also talking about every person on the carers allowance. You're hitting with this cut today. You're hitting everybody between 66 and 70 years of age who's on the state pension, contributory or non-contributory, and you're hitting everybody on the widows and widowers pension. In addition to doing that to the elderly people, you've now singled out the people with disabilities on top of the people who are elderly for this cut as well. You're also targeting people on disability allowance. Everybody in receipt of disability allowance is going to get this cut. This is a €26 cut since you started this last year. It's €6 a week. And of course you'll say you don't hit the weekly rate, but you hit the monthly allowance. And it's the same thing. It's a €6 per week cut for people who relied on the telephone allowance just a few short months ago, and it will be abolished entirely. You're hitting, apart from the elderly, everybody on disability allowance. You're also hitting every person in the country on invalidity pension. You're hitting everybody in the country on the blind pension. And you're hitting everybody in the country on disablement benefit. Why are you attacking the old and the disabled? The old and disabled are not the people who caused the problem. We can all throw the blame around, but I do know that's not our parents and grandparents and the people on disability allowance, invalidity pension and the blind pension and disablement pension. They are not responsible for the cuts here. They should be, and they shouldn't be asked to bear the brunt of them. And Minister, I would ask you to reverse that. The cumulative impact of these measures is to undermine their ability to live a dignified and independent lives. It goes against every instinct of Irish people who have always valued the principle of social solidarity and intergenerational support. These decisions are totally unfair and shameful. Electricity prices have gone up by over 20% since you came to power. Gas has gone up by over 30%. And further increases will be felt by 410,000 people who are also in receipt of the telephone licence. So you're hitting the same people again. On the one hand, the government praises the valuable work of carers, but you're hitting everybody in receipt of a carers allowance by this change here today. When the Minister of Social Protection is asked about this, she glibly says, let them go to the community welfare officer. Well, that's terrible to say to our elderly people. Elderly people and vulnerable people and sick people and people on disability and invalidity don't have the wherewithal to work their way down and fill out the form for a community welfare officer. And it's a glib response from a minister who's out of touch. The cumulative impact of the cuts of the household benefits package represents an unprecedented attack on elderly people, carers and people with disability. Age Action correctly highlighted the hugely stressful psychological impact of the cuts. They have highlighted the widespread anxiety about further cuts and the uncertainty that this is causing for older people. And it's also important to remember, many of the people you're hitting with this are some of the 35 or 40,000 people you're taking the medical card from who are over 70 years of age. It is a double whammy for those people. This is also worth mentioning, and my colleague Michael McGrath mentioned it here also earlier, the abolition of the bereavement grant. There is no way to describe this than to say it's just simply lousy to do that. Simply lousy. This is a PRSI payment that people paid for. And now you're asking hard-pressed families to go to the community welfare officer for an exceptional needs payment to cover the burying of a relative. This runs counter to every instinct and tradition of the Irish people. I cannot believe a Labour minister would stoop so low. 20,000 families are going to lose the bereavement grant based on new figures next year. I am shocked that the Labour Party would actually do that. Also, there are lots of cuts coming in the next couple of weeks, introduced by your party as well, the Labour Party and Minister for Social Protection, that are not in today's announcement. Let's not forget there are changes coming in the 1st of January in relation to one-parent family payments. For families with 3 or more children, there is another cut to the child benefit, with the rate for the 4th and subsequent child being reduced by €10. And that's happening on the 1st of January, even though it's not announced here today. There is no mention of this in what you call a family-friendly budget, but it is actually happening. Parents are being promised by Ms Burton that changes to the one-parent family would occur once a Scandinavian-type childcare system is in place. Minister Fitzgerald has scoffed at that and actually said we don't need such a model of childcare, but in the meantime the changes are going ahead. And you're making changes in a couple of weeks' time, on top of the changes you announced last July, to the age of the youngest child at which one-parent family payment ceases, and the ability of lone parents to earn money in part-time work. And these changes, according to you, will save €112 million in a full year, but it is at a major cost to the family concerned. We know lone parents experience a rate of poverty twice the national average, and these have been failed by the Minister who is introducing these cuts on the 1st of January next. At present, lone parents are entitled to work and stay in receipt of their one-parent family payment if their income does not exceed €130. And that's to encourage those people who have a greater incidence of poverty, those families, for somebody in the house to go to work. Income above that figure, understandably and rightly so, results in some deduction in their allowance, and this is done in order to encourage them to work. Yet again in 2014, the government will drastically reduce the amount they can earn while retaining their lone parents' payment. For many of them, this means it will be not worth their while anymore to go out to work. This is a classic situation of lose-lose, both for the recipient and for the taxpayer. I move on further, and I'm looking at my time to the mortgage interest supplement. This actually, Minister, is one of the worst things in this legislation here today, or in this announcement today. I'm at a loss to understand the logic in deciding to effectively abolish the mortgage interest supplement. There are over 97,400 mortgages in arrear for over 3 months in this country. Deputy Michael McGrath said tackling the mortgage issue is central to the well-being of Ireland as a society and an economy. In the 2.5 years since we've come to government, the people in mortgage arrears have actually more than doubled. And it is against this background I'm deeply concerned at the decision to effectively end the mortgage interest supplement scheme. And that is the only direct cash contribution by the government to people in mortgage arrears. That is the mortgage supplement, and you're abolishing it here today. What are you telling? Can you blame the banks if they send letters to people to vacate their houses? The bank will say, but you're abolishing the mortgage interest supplement. You are leading by example the attack followed up by your friends in the bank in relation to the people in mortgage arrears. You are saying to the bank here today, we're not giving them any more mortgage supplement, and you go and do your business. I want to cite a case of a particular letter I have in my possession, in my office, from a lady who is in arrears in her mortgage to a state-owned bank, Permanent TSB. The total amount of arrears was €106. €106. She was only not even a month in arrears. €106. Your bank, the state-owned bank, wrote to that lady telling her to dispose of the mortgage properly. Get out of your house because you're €106 in arrears. How can you blame a bank for sending that letter when you're standing up here today saying we won't support that person either and we will abolish the mortgage interest supplement? Minister, a few short years ago, when you came to power, the cost of mortgage interest supplement was 60 million per annum. I actually know Joan Burton, she's told me she dislikes it because she thinks it's money for the banks. She just dislikes the payment because she thinks it's money for the banks, and as a result the people in the mortgage arrears are the people who are going to suffer. You're cutting the allowance now. 19,000 people were benefiting from that scheme when you came to office, and by next year you'll have the scheme almost abolished. In relation to the job seekers allowance, it has been mentioned you are reducing the allowance to €100 for new claimants up to 25 years of age, while at the same time failing consistently to have a proper activation measures in place to help them get back into full-time employment. This is a charter to say to the young people of Ireland, emigrate, and my colleague has demonstrated clearly the official policy of the department in relation to telling people to go work in Canada and elsewhere. And this is the backup measure to those type of letters when you say to the young people, we will cut your job seekers allowance if you stay here in Ireland. Also, you're cutting the sick pay, and this is going to be another burden on small businesses. Again, this is another example of Minister Noonan says he wants to help business, but through the expenditure cuts you're making it more difficult on small businesses by putting this cost on small businesses. There are 200,000 small businesses in Ireland employing more than 655,000, and these are a key sector of our Irish economy, and many of these are in the retail hospitality sector where employees' costs account for over 60% of the total cost. These small companies don't have the flexibility to move people around if somebody goes out sick, and it's going to be a barrier to future employment in those areas. When you look at the figures in the Department of Social Protection, as announced here by the Minister in the booklet today that's not read out, the tax on the illness benefit, as I've just mentioned, 22 million is going to be the saving to the taxpayer, but the cost to Irish business and Irish employers. That's a disincentive to employment. The job seekers allowance change, by not giving it to young people and telling them to emigrate, you factored in 32 million because you want them to emigrate and not stay here at all. You're making a cut to the maternity benefit, and that's to save 30 million, and you're reducing the amount you're paying many women who are going on maternity leave, on top of taxing their maternity benefit from the 1st of July earlier this year. What have you against expectant mothers? What have you against expectant mothers? That you'll tax their benefit and you'll reduce their benefit. Shame on you, Minister.
No, make them on, Falcon.
Finally, I want to say that the household benefits package, the bereavement grant changes have been very fundamental issues, and I think you really have gone out of your way to tackle the elderly people. I just want to refer to two items here. One is in relation to the overall government waste. I'd advise you to read the Controller and Auditor General's report. There's €300 million of waste in there. Minister Howland is refusing to deal with it. He hasn't even added it up. His department has said they haven't even checked the figures in the report. You would be better eliminating that waste and inefficient use of government resources rather than punishing the Department of Health and Social Protection. And finally, Minister, this budget will go down. When I learned the Minister said the issue in relation to the National Lottery licence of 2014 will help fund the government local election slush fund. 200 million to buy the votes in the local elections. It's your local election slush fund in the year of the local elections. That was to be put into job creation, but you are using it to buy votes, and you're doing things like road maintenance, sport capital grants, indoor training arenas, housing grants for elderly people, City of Culture. These are all worthwhile issues, but you're introducing those in from the proceeds of the National Lottery, which should have been ring-fenced and kept for the National Children's Hospital as a slush fund to buy votes in the local elections in May 2014. So, Minister, I would ask you to reconsider a number of those changes. I don't know what you have against young people, ask them to emigrate. I don't know what you have against expectant mothers, and especially I don't know what you have against the elderly people, that you're hitting their medical cards, you're hitting their free telephone allowance, and you're hitting them everywhere it hurts. They will be afraid in their houses tonight. They will be losing their alarm that they need in case of an emergency ringing a family member, and 35,000 of them will be losing their medical cards as a result of this budget today.